We're here tonight to discuss the dangers of the network church theology doctrine for the purposes of educating and encouraging all of you current members to tangibly measure the health of your church, regardless if it is in or out of the network. Network leaders have misrepresented scripture, they've withheld information, and they've used deceptive tactics without repentance or repudiation, which speaks to their character. So, who are we going to speak to? Who's qualified to speak to on network theology and doctrine then? We have two former leaders from different network churches, and I believe that their vast experiential knowledge combined with some seminary education provides them credibility. The integrity of their word comes from a lack of any discernible motive other than what I feel is a servant's heart and having a heart to bind the wounded and prevent any more harm to come to anyone in a system that they both feel like they may have helped build.
As Wayne Grudem is the network's theologian. I mean, they hand out his systematic theology to anyone who becomes a member of their churches. Um, and Wayne had gotten a degree from Westminster Theological Seminary. And at that point, I was sold. If that was good enough for Tim and it was good enough for Wayne, then it was good enough for me. And so I started my MA in theological studies in February of 2021. Um, and I want to say here, while I had heard from pastors at Clear River that seminary was more like cemetery because it's where Christians go to die, that was not and has not been my experience. I actually grew a significant amount in a short amount of time. My desire to know the Lord more, and my love for Him grew during that time, actually. And so, um, my early time at seminary was really the beginning of the end of my time in the network. So, really, this book opened my eyes to how to measure what a healthy church was because I had heard, I don't know how many times at both Clear River and South Grove, that we're a healthy church. And that's great that we think that. He defines a healthy church is that a healthy church is a congregation that increasingly reflects God's character as his character has been revealed in his word. And so I think here would be a point where I would ask, whether it be network pastors, or members of network churches, does abuse within your churches follow what a healthy church is defined as? Um, Read through the numerous stories, whether that be on Reddit or the Leaving the Network website. But does God abuse? Does God manipulate? Does he lie? I surely think that you would say no to all of those. But why then are these things found among your people, among your leaders even? If a healthy church increasingly reflects God's character, how then are these things true about your churches? Members in network churches do not have any type of authority, within their churches. And maybe Jeff, you would be the one to speak to that a little bit more, um, if you'd like to jump in. But I feel that there's not any type of, I guess a quick story would be, as I was leaving South Grove, I met with Bobby Malakote and I said, let's suppose, and I wouldn't ever say this, I don't think this of you, but let's suppose that um, that you sinned um, in a way that would disqualify you from being a pastor, and all of the members of the church know it, um, but you have convinced the board that you didn't sin in this way, and um, you're just lying about it. How then do we as a body, how do we fire you? And he said, you can't. And I think that's very telling.
Really early on, learning about the authority that pastors have and small group leaders. And even thinking of it as kind of a badge of honor that we were so submissive, like other people are so rebellious, we're so submissive. Because we trust God and we believe. I mean, I really remember believing as a new person at Vine that the pastors knew everything. Like they knew everything about me. They're like everything I think about, then God tells them, like because they kind of presented themselves that way. It took me a while to realize a lot of it was smoke and mirrors, but
Mm.
um, but at the time, that's kind of the mystique around, coming in and like, especially if you're not used to being around a charismatic church where people are claiming, these things and you're just kind of impressed by it. So
But I think this is where things start to kind of deviate between their membership. Their membership sort of ends at um, serving and being able to come to their family meetings, which I don't even remember what they called. Maybe it was team meeting. Um, those are your two privileges as members. But I think considering texts like Second Corinthians 2, verse 6, where a man is disciplined by the majority of the church, or Matthew 18:18, where Jesus says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And so this is in reference to Christians holding the keys to the kingdom. Um, but members of network churches never affirm who is a Christian or reject who is a Christian by accepting them into membership. They never accept or reject a pastoral candidate. Um, and so they're not able to practice their office of being a member that I feel and others feel that that is what they are called to do in the Bible. And that's not even getting into a certain form of government of a church. It's just the fact that in network churches, members are not actually allowed to be members. This is what Wayne says. He says in the New Testament, there are several examples where church officers were apparently chosen by the whole congregation. That's on page 921. He goes on, another reason for congregational participation in the selection of church officers is that in the New Testament generally, final governing authority seems to rest not with any group outside the church or any group within the church, but with the church as a whole. And that is on page 922. And he continues, if the entire congregation selects the officers of the church, there is more accountability to the congregation. It would seem most wise to have a system whereby the entire church has a significant role in the selection and recognition of the officers of the church. And if even their own theologian disagrees with them, who do they get their ideas of church from?
it's just like you do with the people can do with the Bible. We're going to pick and choose how we interpret this. And yeah, I mean, Grudem says the Bible doesn't tell us exactly what to do. So yeah, this part of Grudem is up for interpretation. So that's kind of what happened there. They never threw him out. They never threw out Grudem, but it was let's decide what benefits us on a higher value of control and uniformity.
Small group leaders, you will be held accountable for what you're doing, manipulating people, um, taking these deep things that they tell you in confidence, and whenever you tell a pastor about that, and you give that to a pastor, you are giving them more and more and more control of these people's. When I look back on my network time, especially as a small group leader, that is the part that I regret the most, is the amount of people that trusted me, um, and I don't think should have trusted me at that time.
It's so much, it's such a weapon. And when we, the leaders, think that we have the authority that we think we have, it's not like we didn't think we had the authority, but we were pretending. We just were that arrogant and we just had that kind of like delusion. And then at one point, I remember 2 years before we left thinking, man, I'd like, like to leave. And literally, but I have no idea where I would go. I have no idea what I would do. I felt like I would be completely adrift in space. But 2 years later, it was after a journey of theological discovery. Why is this? Why is this? And it sounds similar to what you, when you got in seminary, was just coming to the conclusion that no man could possibly be expected to have that kind of authority over another person's will and conscience. That makes them subhuman. That can't possibly be right.
We were all brought to this network leadership conference, and we experienced all these things, all this favor shown to us by not only the pastors who brought us, but other network leaders. Um, I think that is a way that um, some of these untrained men are kind of identified by not only their pastors, but other pastors in the network. It seems like it was a sort of proving ground. But in the end, you end up getting trained by those same guys who were completely untrained.
The highest priority is raising up leaders who can lead in the way that the network wants them to lead. And yeah, who better than family of leaders to be that kind of, to be a sure thing um for that. And I mean, I know my wife, her one of her like most fervent prayers for probably the last 5 years we were in it was that our boys wouldn't end up as pastors in the network.
I was in the room when Shandor gave his talk on unity, and what he calls for is uniformity. There's a complete difference in that in the Bible. When Paul and New Testament leaders are calling these Christians to be in unison, to have unity, that's to beckon back to Israel and how Israel was in disunity nearly all of its existence in the Old Testament. And so there's this reversal happening in the New Testament where these people who come from all these different walks of life, they come together under the gospel in Jesus, and Paul is calling them to, throughout their diversity, calling them to be unified in the gospel. That is completely different than what network pastors and leaders are asking for, and that is more uniformity. And I would just say this, that uniformity, that belongs to cults. I think some of it is this simplification that plays into the control, and it plays into obedience. Are these people going to obey me? Is this person going to obey me in the small things? Because they almost twist uh, Jesus's words, entrusting these people in these small things to make these small changes. Then you're going to gain more and more trust, more and more trust. And
Like the testing in First Timothy 3. So many people think that we left because we wanted to homeschool our kids. I mean, we already had our kids in school. It wasn't that. It was that you don't want me to homeschool because you don't homeschool. And that was like, Shondor's, when he started talking about the unity issue, it's because in dealing with us on that issue, he was like, oh, it's not like it's a big deal, but disagreement is a big deal. If we're going to stay together and plant hundreds and hundreds of churches and not anybody leave, we have to be unified on all things great and small. And there was nothing you could do to convince them that that couldn't possibly be what the Bible would teach. And they would take the passage that you would, Blake, use to prove that it's unity, not uniformity, to try to prove that it's uniformity. And so it was just very overly simplistic, based on control, based on we've come to believe that if someone's humble and teachable, then they're going to believe everything that we say.
but this mystical aspect that we talk about, how um, my pastor could he could speak in tongues and also interpret tongues, and he always knew the correct interpretation of the tongues, even when somebody else got it wrong. But also had a gift of prophecy and a few others. And I was like, how does this guy have all these gifts and the rest of us are just kind of, skimping by? Um, but my first conversation with Bobby about, hey, I'm having these doubts, and it's a conscience issue at this point, being at the church, which he didn't know what that even meant. But his first response when I told him about this, that we needed to talk, was, I think you have a demon. I don't know what you say to somebody who says that about you. To several issues in the network is, if once you press hard enough, you're going to get because I said so. Or
I mean, if you think about what a pastor is in a normal church, a pastor in a normal church is not everybody's dad. He hasn't had to like dominate everybody through the carrot and stick it's a totally different kind of relationship. Yeah, I realized some point after I left that I was culpable for having stayed so long. And I would say if your pastor is nice to you and you love being there, as long as he thinks that he has that kind of authority over you, he is still abusing you, and it is still doing damage to your sense of yourself, your agency, and you're not functioning as a true image bearer. That is a violation. It's violence. He's doing violence. And as long as that is not renounced, these four things, but especially that, I haven't seen anybody actually renounce the Steve Morgan and his teaching, except for maybe a little bit of like, we don't believe in trans local authority anymore. Um, which why? Why not? So why do you not believe in it, but you believe that you have authority over the people and the members? There is no other way for a church to be safe from a pastor, or a pastor to be safe, than to give the church members the authority to to hold them accountable.
um, these men who are, a majority of them that I experienced, are not qualified to be pastors. And if that's the case, then the New Testament, Paul, he puts the burden on you to stop listening to them. Like he says in the Galatians, if anyone comes to you preaching a different gospel, um, if anyone comes to you teaching false doctrine, I would throw in there, if somebody is being abusive, is uh, bearing God's name in vain, if they're not representing God as they should be, um, stop listening to them. And so members, you staying at these churches, you will give an accounting for that. It's not that your pastors will give an accounting for how they led you, but you will give an accounting, for what happens in your churches. And so that's what kept me up at night toward my end of the time, in the network. And I would put that burden on you, because I think the New Testament, and I think God puts that burden on you.